Welcome to the Pillar Podcast, a ministry of Pillar Seminary for contextual leadership. Our goal is to equip listeners to become better readers of Scripture and more skillful leaders in their local churches and ministries. If you would like to learn more about Pillar Seminary and sign up to receive exclusive content from Pillar's faculty, please visit pillarseminary.org.
All right. Hey, everybody. I'm Dan, and I am delighted you are here joining us for yet another edition of our Pillar Podcast 2.0. I have a bit of a scratchy voice. I need to give a shout out because I have been screaming and laughing deliriously for at least the last week and a half because my Texas Rangers won the World Series, and I still haven't recovered. I developed a bit of a cough, but it was totally worth it. I've been waiting 45 years for this, and now at last we have a World Series champion.
People
Joseph.
watch that?
Joseph.
Question too, Joe.
You might not graduate, Joseph.
Well, that's to me, like, you can't give me back those 4 hours that I have to sit there and watch that game.
It's 2.5 now because the rules are changed.
Oh,
At
okay.
any rate, I don't need us to be distracted by the greatest World Series ever. It was actually probably I think it was the least watched statistically on television. I don't care because it wasn't for anybody else but me and the rest of the Texas Ranger fans. So that said, on that very spiritual note, we can go Rangers. Let's dig into our topic. We have with me today Dr. Beth Currier, a Hebrew Bible professor here at Pillar, and as well I got Joe Malarkey, who is a student, almost done with his MDiv and pastoring in central Nebraska as well. So thanks, guys, for being here. Beth, especially to you. You're the you're the reason we're here. So thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you especially to both of you.
Yes, indeed. And go Rangers. So I understand, Beth, that we've got ourselves a topic from the Psalter, and you've kind of teed us up with some conversation points, and we'll mostly just take our cues from you. Joe, you want to get us kicked off here? The claim is, I believe the claim that is being made is that the history of Israel is reflected in the arrangement or editing of the Psalter. And Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you now and just heckle from here on out.
Sure. Well, to be honest, I never knew that headed in when I even through Bible college. It wasn't until I got to Pillar that it was taught, or I was to understand how the whole history of Israel is reflected in the Psalter. So it's really interesting and fascinating. So I don't know if you can just launch us in that, Dr. Currier, and help us out understand that.
Yeah, and I'll also say it was new to me when I was in seminary as well. That's where I learned this way of reading the Psalms too. So it's not original to me. It's something that people have discerned and figured out as they've studied the way the Psalms are arranged. So we know there are 5 books in the Psalter. So we have these clear indications of the end of books 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then the magnificent conclusion of the Psalter as a whole in Psalms 146, 150. But each of the previous books ends with a doxology, kind of a mini bit of praise at the end of each book in the Psalter. So we know that there are 5 books. And what we see, if we read it carefully, is that in book 1, Psalms 1 to 41, the life of David is reflected. And then in Psalms 42 to 72, we see the life of David leading to Solomon. In book 3, Psalms 73 to 89, this is where we see the period of the divided kingdoms leading to the destructions of both. So book 3 is the nadir of the Psalter. It's like rock bottom. It's the darkest book in the Psalms as a whole. And then in in 4 and 5, then we see this turn. Book 4 reflects the exile, and book 5 reflects return and restoration. So that's the large movement that we see behind Psalms in the Psalter, where the history of Israel does seem apparent, moving from book to book.
Okay, so that's really similar to how we understand and are taught to read narratives at Pillar, right? You find this turning point, this action, you find climax, and then you have this restoration part. So does that mean that every psalm has those things in it too, or is it we just talking book wide?
Yes, such a good question, because when we say there's a story, the story of Israel behind the Psalter, we do not mean that every psalm is a plot point. Not every psalm is a plot point. We should not even look for a narrative sequence from psalm to psalm. In fact, when psalms do reflect historical moments, we think, they come out of order. So for instance, in book 3, Psalm 74 portrays the destruction of the temple in 586. And then Psalm 89, I'm sorry, if I could remember numbers, Psalm 78 reflects the destruction of the northern kingdom. So we go from 586 in Psalm 74 to 722 in Psalm 78. So no, we don't look for narrative sequence. We don't look for that kind of like plotted structure, but we just step back and realize, number one, Psalms are the songs and prayers of the people of Israel, right? The psalmists are writing worship for the people, how they connected with the Lord and really stayed connected with the Lord through the turbulent history they have. The story behind the Psalter is evident when it's evident because it reflects what the psalmist and the rest of Israel with them lived through from the start to the end of their time, that we get to see reflected in Psalms 1 to 150. So what's really, I think, important for us to get to see is that ultimately the story of the shape of the Psalter, the story behind the Psalms, is a story of survival, right? So we know the story as it plays out and how the kingdoms are in fact destroyed. But in relationship with God, we see them survive in spite of that. And I should say, as we get started at the beginning, the insights that I draw. So there are a lot of people who read the Psalms this way and have wonderful works about it. But the one I have relied on most and that I find most helpful, and I'm going to be parroting a lot of what they say, so I want to give credit where it's due, is in the Nikot Commentary series. So the New International Commentary on the Old Testament, that series, their commentary on Psalms. There's 3 authors, Nancy DeClasse Walford, Rolf Jacobson, and Beth Laniel Tanner. So credit where it's due. They have a wonderful way of reading the Psalms that they help us see in that commentary.
Okay, so one person didn't sit down and write every Psalm. Like a lot of the Psalms we attribute to David, and we see that through some of these superscriptions, but does that always mean that's the author? Or like, how does a superscription work as we dive into like this introductory stuff before we get into the literal book things going on?
Yeah. And the superscriptions are such an important thing for us to think about. And I think like we don't always even know to have questions about them or to wonder about them. And it's actually interesting because in the Hebrew version of the Bible, in the Hebrew language, verse 1 is always the superscription. But as we noticed in our Bibles, and I remember I said a professor I learned about the Psalms from when I was in seminary said, how did scripture get reduced to 8-point font, right? Because these the superscriptions are these teeny little letters, really small fonts, and then they're not versified in most English Bibles, maybe all English Bibles. Verse 1 usually starts with the first line in the psalm itself. So superscriptions are a really important feature in the Psalms, and they're probably introduced much later. So one of the realities of Psalms is that we see a lot of evidence of the involvement of editors. And I just want to say right at the start that this does not in any way compromise our understanding of God inspiring each and every word, right? So he superintends the whole process from the very beginning of the Bible and each book in it coming together to its final form. And the editors are for sure, working at his direction too. So they have given us the superscriptions, we think, right?
Can I interject too? I think this is pretty consistent understanding of credit where credit is due as authorship in the Near Eastern world, that a lot of times collectors of traditions and editors or packagers of these traditions were understood to be the authors. So there really is less of a black and white categorical distinction in the Near Eastern world. And so this makes a lot of sense of the idea that there's a lot of credit due as far as inspiration is concerned to the Psalter. We see this in the New Testament too, with the gospel writers really collecting and arranging a lot of traditions about Jesus, and certainly adding to it. But this is not novel, and it shouldn't be threatening to anyone. It's very reasonable way of understanding things.
To be fair, it could be the first time a lot of people are hearing this. Like, I remember when, I was taught this, like, hey, the editing process, it was like, well, that's like not orthodox. And then you come to find out, actually, this is probably the best way to view how our scripture has come into being. And, we have the Psalms and the Proverbs and all these different things through the gospel accounts. So yeah, it's not something to be afraid of, but to better understand it.
Yeah, that's a good pastoral word there. It likely could be traumatic, but it need not be as we learn about it. Yeah, thanks, Joe.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, because God is over all of it. So I just like that idea. He superintends every single step of the process from day one to the final form, including the editing.
So there could be more Psalms that were written, right? That's probable. Mm-hmm. And then the reason why we have what we have now is because God worked in such a way to compile these together to give us a story, essentially.
Yeah, and a means of worshiping him. And I really look at the Psalms as models of worship and prayer, right? Of praise and lament and all the things in the Psalter. The superscriptions, if we want to continue on that question of what do they tell us? Like, what information do they give us? Because if they were introduced later by editors, like, what are the editors helping us see about each Psalm? And so one of the questions people have in particular, of course, is the David Psalms, right? Because they say of David. Doesn't that indicate authorship? And it could. Grammatically, though, the way it's in Hebrew is literally like of David. It could also be belonging to David, in honor of, or for David, dedicated to, or for David, or inspired by David. So it actually has grammatically a wide-ranging set of legitimate options of what it could be. So I'm certain David must have written a good bit of the Psalms, because we hear in the narratives, right, that he was a musician and he did write Psalms. So we know that he did this. But yeah, so we don't always know what the of David means, if it means of authorship or just dedicated to, in honor of. And people also point to the idea that David, throughout Scripture, especially the prophets, is actually often a metonymy for the people as a whole, the Davidic dynasty, the ideal king. So it could mean a lot of things. Ideal future king. So yeah, he's super important, and I do think is one of the writers of Psalms. But yeah, just having sort of a light hand when we think of what the superscriptions are telling us in terms of authorship. Also, actually, if I could add just a little addendum, we do see in many David Psalms. So one of the reasons that people think through this as carefully as they do is that in many David Psalms that are attributed to, if we think of it that way, or at least are marked by of David in the superscription, is that they will refer to the temple or the cults, like the priests worshiping in the temple, or historical events that occur after David. So we actually have to have some sort of framework to make sense of that too, because we have Psalms that are talking about things that weren't actually on the earth when David was living. So,
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Hey, let's take a quick break here to let you know that if you like what you're hearing from our professor and you'd like the full Pillar experience, come study with us. Apply now to study with us and pursue a Master of Arts in Contextual Leadership or a Master of Divinity in Contextual Leadership. You can find more information online and the application at pillarseminary.org/apply. And if you have any questions, you can email us at admissions@pillarseminary.org. We're flexible, we're affordable, we're accessible, and we'll meet you right where you are. Join us as we reimagine seminary for anyone, anywhere.
Yeah, superscriptions.
So we have all these Psalms put together in a way for us to understand a story. Like, one of the things that just kicking around in my head, you said book 1 is David's life, right? Okay. Why do we start with David's life instead of all the way back at Sinai with the birth of the people of God and entering into that covenant?
Yeah, great question. And I will say, so many of the Psalms do actually go all the way back there, right? So we do have Psalms that go back further before David in the history and recount the really important saving events, even creating events, and all of the sustaining events that took place before David to keep the people in relationship with God. But I imagine, and this is a guess, that we start with the life of David because he is so prominent. He is someone who initiated the worship of Israel. I mean, he's the first, like king that was truly pleasing to the Lord over the people. He was the, potentially greatest king ever. So he is super important and did, I'm sure, initiate a lot of the worship in song that we get to see reflected in the Psalter. So I think probably because he got things started.
Some of the superscriptions have like historical information in them, like maybe where David was or what was going on at that time in his life. Like, how do we handle that stuff?
Yeah. And that's such an important question because as we think about what these are for, we get real historical information in 13 of the superscripted Psalms. So 13 superscriptions have historical information in them. And I actually really like the way the Nycot commentators, so that Nycot commentary I mentioned, the way that they deal with this, and many others do as well, but I'll just refer to them and what they've said as it's helped me think through it myself too. And that is that we look at the historical information in the historical superscriptions as, number one, a window into how people interpreted the Psalms in their earliest stages, right? And the way that the interpretation is evident is that these historical scriptions are like an interpretive key, telling us how to read and use that particular psalm. A good example of this is Psalm 34. So if you look at the superscription in Psalm 34, that superscription reads, of David, when he changed his behavior before Abimelech, so that he, Abimelech, drove him, David, out, and he, David, went away. Okay, so this is a terrible moment in the life of David, one of the worst, I am sure, maybe the worst, right? It's just a tragedy and it's devastating to him. He's terribly grievous over this conflict with his son. Then what do we read in the first line of the poem? I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise will always be in my mouth. So what I think the Nycot commentators and others as well help us see is that this is this terrible situation. And what is the first thing out of David's mouth in this song? Blessing the Lord, praising him always. So even in the midst of this terrible, terrible moment, the psalmist David is giving us a model of what we can do in relation with God, even in those terrible times. So that's a helpful way to, I think about the historical information prescription.
So Psalms 1 and 2 serve as an introduction. What does that mean for us? Can you help us understand what it means to have those two Psalms introduce the Psalter?
Yeah. So Psalms 1 and 2 are two of the only Psalms in Book 1 that do not have a superscription. And they don't have a superscription likely because they were introduced later, giving us an introduction to the book as a whole. So how do they introduce the book as a whole? What do they do as an introduction? They do two really, really important things. One, they establish what the Psalms are, and then wrapped up in that, what Psalms are for. And then two, they ask readers or hearers in whatever context they're experiencing two really big questions in light of what the Psalms do. So Psalm 1, we remember, is the one probably familiar to many people listening. Blessed is the person who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the instruction of the Lord. And on his instruction, he meditates day and night. And then it goes on, right? He's a tree planted by streams of water. He flourishes in what God has designed him to do. And then in contrast, the wicked, right? They're like chaff. They blow away with the wind. They won't stand in the congregation of the Lord. So here we have this introduction to God's instruction. So number one, what the Psalms are is instruction, right? They're Torah. Psalms are Torah. And there's actually a midrash from the 800s where rabbinic scholars comment on the 5 books of the Psalms. They relate the 5 books of the Psalms to the 5 books of Torah, right? They say in the same way that Moses gave Israel the 5 books of Torah, David gave Israel the 5 books of Psalms. So Psalms are instruction. Psalms are Torah. And we get that from from Psalm 1. Then from Psalm 2, here we go to now Psalm 2 begins, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? And then we see this image of these kings and world leaders who are amassed against the Lord and his anointed, his son, his king, right? So Psalm 2 is giving us this picture of all that we could be afraid of in the world and all that we could allege ourselves to in the world, right? Leaders, human leaders of nations and groups. But of course, the one we're supposed to fear, and not just fear, but trust and take refuge in, is the Lord himself and his anointed, his son. So then we read in verse 12, the last verse in Psalm 2, kiss the Son, lest he be angry. So the Son is the Lord's anointed, who before Jesus would have been conceived as the King of Israel, right? So that's important. So there was someone they were looking to, even before Jesus comes, but he's the one they need to allege to. And then the very last line in the Psalm, blessed are all who take refuge in him. So Psalm 1 tells us the Psalms are instruction. Psalm 2 tells us the Psalms are refuge. And the two together, I like to think of as the Psalms. Psalms 1 and 2 together are telling us that the Psalms are instruction in how to take refuge in God in each moment we live through. So Psalm 1 asks, which way are we going to take? Where will it be the way of God's instruction? And Psalm 2 asks, who are we going to fear? Where will we go for refuge? And what's really important, and I think is key, is the transition from Psalm 2 to Psalm 3. So Psalm 2 ends with this idyllic picture of someone taking refuge from the Lord. And then Psalm 3 opens with lions and tigers and bears, oh my. Psalm 3 opens with this picture of David's life, which is not an easy life. David's life is lions and tigers and bears. So it gets us into the real world real quick. And I do just have to give credit where credit's due again. That lions and tigers and bears, oh my line comes from a professor I had in seminary, the wonderful Dr. Dennis McGarry. So quoting him, he helps me see that important transition.
Hey, while we're on the subject of teachers, I had a teacher who wrote a book, Psalms as Torah, my doctoral supervisor, how to read the Psalms ethically. And so if you want to dig a little deeper into what the Psalms are for and how to engage with them as Torah, Gordon Wenham has written a wonderful little work on that, Psalms as Torah. So, all right, back to...
Well, just off that though, like you read Psalm 1, it sounds a lot like Deuteronomy 6. You know, Psalm 1 talks about you're not standing in the way of sinners or sitting in the way of scoffers or, all this stuff. And then you have almost the reverse of that, like in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Like this is what you're supposed to be doing. And one of the things like I try to tell our people in our church is like, you and your kids are being discipled by someone or something. Like, and you have to make the choice what that's going to be. And I think you get that picture here between Deuteronomy and Psalm 1 and what that can be like. Now, and then I have another question. Sorry. Just so many questions.
Keep it coming, Joe.
But, and this is just something that came to me off the top of my head as you're talking, like, are there, prophetic Psalms or apocalyptic Psalms, or I know there's, Psalms of lament, right? And we have the Psalms of the ascents and all that, but like, are we just like, how do we tell the difference between like, this is going to be in the future? Is that even a thing? Or this has already happened in the past? Can you, I don't know, clarify that for me? Cause I'm confused.
Yeah. It's interesting. A lot of people do describe different types of Psalms. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind when we think of types of Psalms is that Psalms can be more than one thing.
Okay.
So there are Psalms of praise, Psalms of lament, wisdom Psalms, royal Psalms. I have never heard anyone give a category of prophetic Psalm However, we do see Psalms look to the future. We see them look to a time of restoration. We see them hope for something different than what life is like now, when life is hard now. So that's not a category that people use necessarily, but that doesn't mean we don't have Psalms that project ahead to give hope for a hard moment in the past.
So I feel like I have to take the softball that you just lobbed and talk about Messianic Psalms as they were received in the first century and understood in the first century. And to maybe add some clarity to what Beth was saying, I fully agree that I don't believe they were originally held to be prophetic in some sense. However, by the first century, this is all post-exile, when this thing was being read and sung together. We have folks, returnees, and then folks in the diaspora who are all reading these Psalms of David going, those were the good old days. Oh, and aching for the days to come when these Davidic Psalms would in their sense be fulfilled. So they a lot of anticipation or hope came to be attached to these things because of the context in which they were read. So I don't think anybody would have said, well, Psalm 2 talks about David coming again. It's not that. But when Jesus came, a lot of these things were attached to him, looking back, trying to make some sense from the scriptures. So Messianic Psalms are not predictive, but they came to encapsulate the hopes of folks waiting for God to come fully fix things that weren't fully fixed. It gave them language, and so it came to be attached. So that's, and I do hear a lot of in churches folks talking about kind of prophetic psalms and the like, and I think that's some of what they're hoping to wrap their minds around. Is the psalms seem to get applied to Jesus, but they weren't predicting Jesus. Jesus just lived, he inhabited or incarnated these hopes that were there, I think is a better way of saying it.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you said that, because I should have connected the word prophetic to messianic, and I didn't, because I just didn't. But that's really important.
Yeah.
No, that's really important, because there are, even just messianic bits in Psalms, right? And Psalm 2, of course. Right. So I don't know, Joe, if that's even what made you ask the question, but yeah, it's like, well, this is about Jesus. And I do think that it's important to build on what Dan said, to say that, these messianic bits, the messianic hopes of the people of Israel, and then the Jewish people, when they become known as that, and their hopes for an ideal Davidic ruler, right? Who, we know is Jesus, and they think differently about. But I do think that we can look at them and maintain a sense of Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment, because he was the only perfect Davidic ruler, leader, right? Like he wasn't king on earth, but he's king of the universe, right? So,
and just another important nuance: the New Testament language of fulfillment is not almost ever predictive. The way Matthew uses it, for example, and all these scriptures that and this was written and Jesus fulfilled it, is not like they are necessarily looking for. He just fills the hope expressed there. And that fits a lot more of the language of fulfillment, embodies it, fleshes it out. He fulfills the law in the same way. That doesn't mean the law was waiting for him to, anyway. That's, I think, is perfectly consistent. And another one of these things that might be threatening but need not be, that we've been talking about here, is we're kind of scratching beneath the surface of things. How about this, guys? We're still rolling here, and I think it might be beneficial if we split this up into at least one more, where we can really dig into some of this content. We've introduced the concept. Beth, you've been really helpful. Joe, thanks for your guidance through all of this. We have, though, had some more technical conversations about the Psalms, and I want to make sure that as we leave this first podcast on the Psalter, that Beth, can you just kind of sum up for us how the Psalms are effectively a guide for our devotional life or our instruction, whether individually or as community? Maybe that would be a place where we could land this first episode.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think having just talked about Psalms 1 and 2 set us up for how the Psalter as a whole is still so needful for us today. And that is, in the Psalms, we get models of, which serve as instruction for, how to make God's instruction and this making him our refuge, how we relate to him. So as the songs of the people, as the songs and prayers and what the people of Israel used in worship, we get models of how they stayed connected to God through this turbulent story that they lived through. So for us, we have different turbulence in life that we experience, but the Psalms are just as much a model of how to stay connected with, how to stay in relation, how to seek refuge from the Lord as we live through what we live through. So that they are instruction for us in taking refuge for God as in God, as much as they were for the earliest people who used the Psalms for that.
I think we can unpack that a little more in our next podcast. I think that's a wonderfully suitable stopping point for us here. Joe, thanks for driving the conversation forward. And Beth, thanks for all the great content.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, guys. I think we're done here. We'll pick this back up in round 2 of the podcast.
See ya.
Sounds great.
Peace. I'd like to remind you that if you have any questions or comments with regards to the podcast content or any suggestions for future podcast topics, you can email us at podcast@pillarseminary.org. I can't promise that we'll necessarily get to it as a podcast topic, but we will do our best to interact with you and get your questions answered and respond to your comments in a timely fashion.
Thanks for listening to the Pillar Podcast, a ministry of Pillar Seminary for Contextual Leadership. Please visit us on the web at pillarseminary.org to find out more about our academic degree programs and non-credit learning opportunities. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, and podcasting platforms. Thanks again for listening.